All right, so I'm just going to start and share screen just to share with everyone kind of some new updates actually, which is that we have a new kind of user interface for our flow lister is what we're calling it. So things are going to look a little bit different if you have been into the editor before or even been to one of these trainings. So we have now you can see all the different thumbnails of right now we're on our featured flow page. But you can also go to different folders similar as before where you can check out what's been shared with you and then what's also in your own personal flow folder. So it's the same functionality, but you can also specify, when has this been created, as well as a kind of sort mechanism based on recently updated or most popular. And in this little settings icon, you can see how to go into either view mode, edit, do some other various settings. But just wanted to show that off really quick before we dive in, but always able to create a new flow from this little icon here. So I'm going to start just by showing you something very a chart type on what we have. A chart is called a hierarchy chart, just to kind of demo some chart that we'll be able to build with some transformations we make in this data transformer. So this is just a hierarchy. You can't really tell what exactly the data is and what's going on here, but I'm sure everyone's seen this type of chart before where it's kind of showing like an organizational structure of how data is connected and in certain levels as well. And then on this next step, I'm just going to show how we can actually put this on a globe as well. So you can map hierarchical information to globes. But just to show you really quick, I'm going to go back to this first step and show you what this data transformer looks like. So I'm using our global life expectancy data, which is just in our library. And then I'm clicking edit here. And let me just start. We have these things called snapshots. So that's kind of the first idea of everything. I'm just going to go back to our raw data just to show you kind of what that looks like and what we're starting with. So in this data set, our global life expectancy data set, we have the year here, the country, region, life expectancy in years, population, income, latitude, longitude, continent, and then there's this column called event, which is mostly blank except for certain years. We've put in where the life expectancy dips, what event is kind of attributed to that. So that's a little bit of what this data set is about. But just to explain a little bit more about this data transformer tab and some of the things you can do with it, there's two types of ways you can load in data. One is with a CSV file, which is our typical way that we load in data. And you can also use a Google Sheet. So when you use a Google Sheet, what you'll do is just make sure that the sheet is public. So that way Flow can edit it or access it. And then you'll just copy and paste the URL into here and click import. And that's pretty much it. You'll be able to have a button that says update to once you do import it. So that way, if there's any changes that you make in the sheet, the update button will pull in those new changes. So I'm going to head back over to CSV file. And there's two buttons here, update domains on reload. So if you have a chart, for example, where you say you want the x-axis to start at 0 and end at 100, but your data doesn't start at 0, your minimum data value is 30, for example. If you have this button unchecked, it'll keep those settings there. So that way the domains don't update for you and you keep what you have. Whereas if you click this button, it'll automatically reset those chart minimum and maximum to whatever your minimum and maximum is here in the data file. And then this setting is pretty self-explanatory. Treat commas as numbers, or for numbers as thousand separator. This is just because we have some customers in Europe where the comma is a period there in terms of decimal points. So it's just a little bit of customization for them over there in Europe. We can also edit NA values. So for example, if in your data set you have null as your NA value and you want Flow to ignore all of the nulls and not plot them as points, you can go and click into this and then add in any value that you want, or say you have North America and that's how you're specifying it, it's NA, and you want that to actually be a value, so you can erase it there and just click that X button, and whether or not to ignore those values here. So let me go back into edit mode. Let's see what else. You could format the columns here, where this is where you specify if you want it to be numeric or a category or a date value or a European date value, because the way they do month and day is swapped there. So for each of your columns, you have these settings here. But you can also do some things with rounding, precision, and formatting. And you get an example of what that looks like output here. So for rounding, for example, if we go to latitude and we want this to show in the thousands, it doesn't make sense because, latitude is only 30. It's only to the tens place. But if I show you this for population, for example, we can change this to million, and then it just rounds it and puts that million number there. So you don't have a really long string of numbers. It's a little bit easier to see. What you can also do is for latitude, longitude, you can actually change like what we're rounding towards. So you can do to the 0.01 decimal place and it'll kind of cut that off for you there. For latitude and longitude, I like to keep them as precise as possible, but just some examples of how you could do things here. And then format is just something where you can either add a $ in front of things, a percentage sign, a little degree symbol for temperature and things like that. Just to show you what that looks like. The percentage, I will say, is a little bit confusing to work with at first because Flow takes into account that you probably have a decimal point that you want to convert into a percent. So for example, if you have a 0.5, that'll then turn it into 50% and put the percent sign at the end. So if you're going to use this, percent formatting, just keep that in mind. So that's kind of how you can format columns. What else? Okay, so we have this snapshot functionality, which is kind of a way that you can create different versions of your data set and have them not be separate CSV files, where you can reference them in different swarms in the Flow editor. And it's just a little bit easier if you want to do any kind of customization there. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new snapshot, and you can delete snapshot, rename it. I'm just going to keep it as snapshot 2. And then after you're done, you'll click update snapshot. And if you try to exit without saving, it'll prompt you. So that way, in case you forget to hit update, it'll try and make sure that you recognize that you want to save those changes. So now to get into kind of more settings that are under the covers here that are not as overtly obvious. You can do any kind of filtering here by typing into this box. So say I only wanted the year 2000. Now that I typed that in, all of these years here are just the year 2000, and it's just every country for that year. But if I click on this little filter icon next to the type in box, we can say, okay, we want it to equal 2000. Maybe we actually just want it to be greater than 2000. So it's from the year 2000 forward. Or, there's some other settings in here that are less than or equal to, or in a certain range. And you'll be able to specify this range, okay, 2000 to 2005. 5 or something like that. And there is multi-filtering as well. Like you can use Logic to layer these filters. So if you wanted to do this this setting and another setting where it's greater than 2003 or something like that. And this is specifically helpful for categorical variables. Like you want to have all countries, like if you want to have Australia and Brazil, for example. Or you can use OR filtering where, for example, if we do less than 1980, and so when we use and, obviously nothing comes up, but if we use or, we'll get all the years before 1980 and in the range of 2000 to 2005. So it's kind of searching for whether or not either of these requirements are satisfied, rather than both of them have to be satisfied in order to show the data there. So that's kind of what filtering capabilities we have. And then over here, if you hover over a column header, you'll see there's this little 3-line hamburger icon that pops up. So if you click on that, there's a lot more settings hidden under the cover there as well. Which first is our filter tab, which we've seen. And then there's these up and down lines, these vertical lines, which are kind of representative of columns. And you see this kind of mimics this interface over here, which basically will say, okay, if you don't have a use for certain columns and you just want to get them out of the way, like if we don't really want to look at income, we can just uncheck that and then income column goes away. And it's matched over here as well. And then the final thing in here is this vertical hamburger icon. So here we can pin columns. So if you always want to see the year, but you have, say, 15 columns and you're scrolling back and forth, but you want to remember what you're talking about, similar to Excel, you can pin columns to the left or the right. You can also auto size this column or auto size all columns if you have a longer string of text. You can go in here and manually, make this bigger or smaller, but sometimes it's easier to just go ahead and auto size the columns to fit the text inside. There is a little bit here in terms of grouping, which I'll come back to in a moment. And then you can reset columns as well, just kind of make everything back to their default. So something that I did here on accident, that I do sometimes often on accident, but you can change the sort of each of these columns just by clicking on them. So if I click once, we kind of have a ascending sort, so going from 1850 up. And then if we click it again, it'll be descending, so from the larger year down, and then clicking it a final time just reverts it back to its normal state. And so for numerical columns, it's from largest to smallest or smallest to largest. And then for categorical, it'll be alphabetical. So for Afghanistan, it's already in that alphabetical order, but we can change it, and you'll see it starts with the Zimbabwe. So that's a little bit about that. And then let me go into the groupings.
And Sierra, can I actually interrupt you real quick, which is to maybe expand on for the filters and the sorting when that's applicable. So I think the one thing I was going to note was sort of like how you need to create a second swarm, or just maybe the use case of when you would do the sort or the filter in this versus the filter on the swarm definition page.
Sure. So I'll just go out of this for now, and you'll see it prompts me. So what Michael is talking about is we also have a filterability in our actual swarms. So here we're looking at the swarm details, and if we go into filters, we still have the ability to create filters based on those same tools, where we can filter the year, like we did before, and we still have the same options to create multi-level filters. But in this view, you can actually create more than just two. So we tend to use this more for filters with data that we already have, and we want it to be, changing throughout the swarm from step to step. But if you want to have another swarm, say on the same step, I'm just going to go ahead and create a new swarm just to show you this, and use our global life expectancy as well as the snapshot that we've just created. So you want to have another swarm on the same step. I'm just going to move it over a little bit, just so it's a little bit easier to see. And now the data is filtered just to those years that we were talking about. So, maybe we want to have the full view in this swarm and then a smaller view in this swarm. I'll show you just by making a quick scatter plot where the width is on the year axis and the height axis is showing life expectancy. So you'll see there's this gap here where there are those years that we filtered out. For some reason, this is flipped. In terms of the year where we're starting is the newer year. So let me just see why that might be. I'm not quite sure. I've never seen
Yeah,
that.
that's odd. I wonder if you hit the reset camera button? Is the camera in the same spot?
Okay, yeah, we're flipped around to the camera being on this side, so that makes sense.
Yeah.
Sometimes I just
fine.
confuse myself. So always, I can reset camera back to normal. So
That's
yeah,
great.
that's kind of a demo of like how the filters can be used in different ways, but we do tend to use the filter in the swarm definition a little bit more than we would in the data transformer, just because there's more layering capabilities that we can use there.
Yeah. And I just want to add one more thing to that, which is I like to think of the data transformer as similar to what you would do in Excel or Google Sheets or Python or something before you bring the data file into Flow. And so it allows you to do some sorting, which affects animations. So the sorting is the order in which the data appears impacts the animation. And so sorting will impact that, in addition to how it shows up for a few other fields. So I like to think of it as like a pre-processing step in some sense. And you can also make, like Sierra mentioned, multiple snapshots and have multiple swarms for different scenarios. So it's like, yeah. So anyways, my two little snippets, but yeah, sorry, go ahead, Sierra.
Yeah, so now I just wanted to explain a little bit about this grouping mechanism that we have. And let me just show you from where we were working before in this snapshot too. So what we like to use for groups is this hierarchy chart that I kind of showed you earlier. So what you can do is kind of define what columns are, in certain levels of your hierarchy. So the top level for this data set would be continent. So we can drag that over here, and that'll be our first group. And you'll see that it automatically, collapses all of these columns into these specific groups based on the continent column. So you can still expand them with these carets here, but you'll just notice that now they are grouped by this specific continent. And what we can also do is set subgroups. So right now we just have this one group, but we can even go from continent to region. So that way, when we expand this out, we have, and you'll see here, this is a place where we need to auto size the column, where we can see everything in the text object. So now we have kind of a hierarchy of information. So we have Asia, but then we also have these regions inside of Asia, Southern Asia, Eastern Asia, etc. And if you open those, they have the data inside. So something that we like to do once we specify this hierarchy is, you'll notice all the other fields are kind of blank. So if you're going to use any of these fields in a hierarchy chart, which I'll show you briefly in a moment, you want to make sure that they are specified, like they need to be aggregated in some kind of way up to that level. So for example, life expectancy, we can go into this little hamburger icon again, and you'll notice there's a new a setting that pops up, which is value aggregation. So say we wanted to look at what the average life expectancy was over those years that we've specified for each of those continents and regions. We can click that, and Flow will automatically calculate that for you. So now we can look at a more broad view of what the average life expectancy is. I will note we also have now these settings to expand and collapse all of these here. So if you want to look at everything, you can expand everything as well as collapse everything. So what else we can do is some other value aggregations, like for example, population. We can do, the maximum population over all of the years for each of these regions, for what country has the largest population. We can do the average latitude and longitude, and that's kind of how we get that globe view of where exactly the dot is placed above the space, in terms of the middle ground between all of the countries within each of these regions. And other things like event don't really make as much sense to aggregate. Region, because we already have, region and continent here, what I'll sometimes do is go ahead and click first. And this just puts in, a text object of, this is Asia. So that way it's not blank there. And if we want to add a label or something like that, those will be there and they'll be able to be referenced. Yeah, so I'm just going to go ahead for now and update that snapshot. And then show you a little bit about like how to use the snapshot in terms of building that hierarchy. So I'll just use the snapshot we were creating, or no, I'll just use this one that's already built and then just kind of show you the settings actually. So we can choose now the type is hierarchy, and this chart type will only show up if you have those groups set in the data transformer. So if you're trying to build a hierarchy and you're wondering why it's missing, it's because those are not set explicitly. And so Flow doesn't realize that a hierarchy chart can be made. And then there's some different layouts you can choose if you want it to be a circle like this or a linear chart, which is something that is maybe more familiar to people. And then you can choose the spacing here, which I always find super fun to play with, where each of the nodes, you can choose how far away they are from each other, where you just drag them and you can see in real time where those dots are spaced. So there's lots of customization there. And then pretty much all I have right now in terms of the height, which you can see here, it's a little bit, there's a height dimension. I'll change it back to circular just so you can see what that looks like. So if I turn this off, it's just a flat chart, right? But if I turn it on, and I could choose the column to be anything here, I could choose it to be even the countries. So we kind of get like a spirally type of chart where each country is a different height, or even based on population, where the larger countries and continents are higher up there. But I like to do it based on hierarchy level. And this can get a little bit confusing if you are new to Flow or new to hierarchy charts, because we don't have anywhere that specifically says what the hierarchy levels are. So I'll just go through really quick. These are the hierarchy levels here. And I still even get confused a little bit about, where does 0 start and where does, which one is 0, which one's 1, 2, and 3. But it just takes a little bit of playing around with, and you'll kind of see from there which one's which. So I'll show you more about that in the global chart and how to configure that. But yeah, that's kind of how you can do the using the hierarchy. Let me go over to globe now. So mapping this on a globe is just using, creating a map that's a globe, and then using the map from coordinates, which we have the latitude and longitude in there, and that's kind of where that average comes in. So because on the higher levels here, like these are our continent levels up at the top, it's the average latitude and longitude between all of the countries there. So that's how that's kind of aggregated. And so the specified here. And what we can do, how we got that effect is in our additional dimensions. So if I turn this off, you'll see it kind of just looks like a little bit of a spidery chart here, where you can't really see any hierarchical information. But what I did was add a height offset, and that's based on the hierarchy level. So the minimum hierarchy level is 3, which means minimum is like on the globe. So offset for minimum is 0. So that's going to be right here on the globe. So these are level 3 hierarchy, which means if we go into our data transformer, country here is level 3 in the hierarchy. And then this will be level 2 and level 1. So starting from left to right, going from 1 to 3. But when you're building these charts, this will automatically start with 1, and this will go to 3. And then it seems like everything's a little bit upside down. So, we'll have to go in and manually switch those. So that way the smallest hierarchy level is actually on the globe, and the very first hierarchy level, which is continent, is higher up from the globe. So that's kind of how I build these. I also size the dots based on population and applied a color scheme based on the continent, just to make that a little bit easier to see. So I see there's one message in the chat. All right, Stephen asked, is it possible to make one of the regions clickable? Is it like click the US and be taken to a new map of just the US? So we are working on an implementation for something that we call variables, which will allow you to click on any dot and have any action occur. So that should be rolling out within probably the month of May. We're just kind of testing everything and making sure that it's, user friendly and like able to be used by you guys, and that everything makes sense there. But that right now we just have the interactivity of being able to click on something and there'll be a pop-up. So let me just go down to interactions. So right now we have a pop-up selected where we've done training on this in the past, so there's a little bit more information out there in case I go through it a little bit quickly. But you can click what continent or what columns you want to show up here in your pop-up, and these pop-ups will definitely depend on your what you set in your data transformer. So for example, you see region, we don't have that for the highest level because or country, because for all of Asia, we're not going to specify a country for that because it's a bunch of different countries, but we do have the sum of population here. So there's some different things in terms of like formatting that you can do here, kind of how I showed in the data transformer, that you can do for pop-ups as well. But you can also do something called highlight, where there's a lot of different settings here, but where if we click on this, it highlights all of the different same hierarchy levels, or we can change it to continent, where now if I click on this, it shows, okay, now this is highlighted and we're just going to focus on this continent. Um, so that's kind of what we have right now as far as interactivity for clicking on dots. But in the future, we will have the ability to click on a dot and have it take you to, bring up another chart or another map or filter the data in a specific way or things like that. So, there are some abilities what you can do with size, right? If you have all the dots to be really, really small, almost invisible. And then when you click on a dot, now they have this size of 0.02. And so, these tiny dots here become, let me change this back to continent, become more visible now that we click on it. So you can, kind of mess with things as far as, having dots that are almost invisible become visible. With the size option here, you can also filter based on, certain things. So if we double click this, it will remove all of the other dots. And you can configure that to just be, a single click as well. So if we do a single click and then it automatically, removes all the other data there just to focus on that specifically. So there are some creative things you can do with the highlighting and filtering on select. So I'll just note that there to answer Stephen's question. Yeah, thanks, Stephen. Do you have any other questions from anyone? About the data transformer or hierarchy charts or just, anything that comes to mind?
I've got one question, Sierra, and that has to do with the not null filtering. So let's suppose I have in my life expectancy data set. Let's say I have a null data point. The life expectancy is null for that year. So I understand that record is removed. How about if I have a null in one of the categorical variables? Is that row also removed, or what are the rules there? Do you know?
Yeah, so it won't be the entire row, but for example, if I expand this out and you had, for this column, for example, Argentina was null, it will just not show if you're looking at where maybe a scatter plot where one of your axes is country. And you have, no Argentina values, that Argentina will just not show in the column, and then the dots won't plot for that chart. But for example, if you're looking at just, life expectancy and region, and these regions are all filled out, it will populate for those, for that chart. It will show Latin America and then the life expectancy. It just won't show for whatever column is null.
Okay.
Does that kind of make sense, Bill?
Oh, yeah. Thank you very much. Yeah, the other thing I noticed as you were going through your filtering, the number of rows that are present in your current snapshot always show down at the bottom. And
Yeah.
I'm always looking there as a sanity check just to make sure that the filtering I'm expecting to do, I'm actually doing.
Yeah, that's a really great point. I think this is super helpful when, you're, kind of trying to condense your data down, or even just to make sure that everything imported correctly. Just being able to verify how many rows are here, as well as, Flow kind of gets a little bit queasy around, 60,000 rows or something like that. Things start to move a little bit slower depending on how many columns you have. So just kind of to check there and keep that in mind. That's definitely great, great tip.
Do you have any quick tips for any things people run into more often? At least for me, I always forget to select the snapshot after I get back in the flow. So I'm always confused there and stuff like that. Just wondering if there's any sort of tips or tricks that you have that I might not know about it either, actually.
Yeah, I think that is a good kind of point, is like when you're creating a new swarm and you just got really, into that snapshot and creating a new kind of form of that data, and you're like so deep into that, you're kind of like, oh wait, I need to, you're just kind of expecting, if I click on this, that's going to be the snapshot, right? But when you start creating the chart, if you notice, like, for example, that this hierarchy is missing, you'll see, okay, you need to create a snapshot, and you're like, wait, I already created a snapshot. So then you can just kind of go up here, select your snapshot. Or if, you're expecting a chart to look a certain way, or there's, too many dots and you've filtered it down, it's a lot of it is just kind of like being able to troubleshoot a little bit. And I guess I use troubleshoot in a very light way, but just being able to look at what you've done so far and see, okay, where would something maybe be going awry? Like, have I missed a column somewhere? And Flow will usually tell you, like, for example, if I go to create a scatter plot, we kind of have this red box around some of these columns that are not chosen, because Flow is wanting you to select those in and kind of remind you that there's something you're missing here. So we do try and help you out a little bit with missing things like that. But for the snapshot, it's a little bit of, kind of just putting yourself back into that there's many different snapshots if you've created more than one, or that there's a possibility to look at the data in different ways. So hopefully
Great.
that makes sense.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I'll try to be posting another few examples, but one thing I've started to find myself using snapshots for is when I have within one data set, essentially one section, or like two different parts of the same data set. And so what I mean by that is for a recent flow I did on fossil fuel and renewables and the consumption of that in the US. Essentially what I wanted to do is visualize it so that the fossil fuels made it seem like we were taking that away from the earth, that we were carving it out, that it was going negative as opposed to looking positive. And then for the fossil fuels and renewables, that it would be positive and going up. And so to do that was just simply rotating the swarm entirely, but I needed two different swarms, one for the fossil fuels and one for the renewables, which I did through snapshots in order to format them slightly different. So it's actually pretty powerful for when you want to sort of split up your data set into maybe like the main thing you want to focus on and then the rest. Or there's all sorts of scenarios that I've started to come up with now that I'm ending up using snapshots a lot more. So the one key is that right now, at least for every swarm, you can only have one snapshot assigned at a time. So if you want a second snapshot, you need to have that on the second swarm or the third swarm, or et cetera. So you can't switch between snapshots on the same swarm, which is something that might be changing in the future, but for now is sort of the prereq. But yeah, I think hierarchies are one of these sort of not unsung, but sort of the extremely powerful. We've actually, you can build a whole balance sheet, cash flow statements, and income statement just with hierarchies. That, so much of the information we consume really is in sort of this hierarchy type structure, and 3 dimensions, especially 3 dimensions on the globe, et cetera. It really has a lot of potential. So highly encourage people to explore this, and we'll try to post more and more examples. But I do think that these interactive hierarchies is definitely one of the areas that Flow is sort of uniquely positioned to where there's just not too many other things quite like it. So.
Yeah, and I guess to elaborate a little bit on Michael's point about how each swarm can only have one snapshot, if you, for example, do a filter on this step, but then, the number of dots were to change on this step, Flow doesn't really know where the dots should come from, basically, like where, because the way flow works is kind of like from step to step, you have these dots that are, moving, and it's helpful to build this mental model of like each dot is a thing, it's a row in your data set or a person or something that you can kind of build these different organizational, visualizations or structures that kind of help tell this story. So right now it's just kind of the thought of like, how do you deal with all of the different circumstances that you can change in the snapshots, and where would the dots come from if there's a filter or, an organizational structure that you wanted to change? How would you recognize that the hierarchy level would be different or something like that? So that's just something that we're working through. But I know we're close to time here. I want to allow a little bit more time if anyone has any other questions.
Any limits here on the number of snapshots you can have for a given CSV file?
Not that I've run into yet. I haven't pushed it to like more than 15, but I don't think there's any reason. Flow might be a little bit more sluggish, like if you have 15 swarms, something like that, but there's no hard limit or anything I've encountered as snapshots right now.
Okay, and second kind of related question, can you build a snapshot off of an existing snapshot?
In terms of editing, I believe so. But in terms of, copying a snapshot and editing it, I'm not sure if that makes sense.
Okay.
I don't think so.
Yeah, I have not experimented around with that yet. So.
Yeah, I think you kind of have to start, from your default data, or if you are in a snapshot, you can make further edits and then save it as a new snapshot.
Yeah.
So. I do see a question from Dan. There are 2 subscription tiers for Flow. What is the difference between the 2? So if you're referring to the education versus the pro, one is, if you have a .edu email address, that's the education pricing. And then there's the pro, which is for more enterprise customers or individuals that are self-service. But then there's also within each of those, there's a monthly price and then a yearly price. So we give you a little bit of a discount for the yearly price. Bill, does that seem about right?
Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah. By the way, I've been toggling back and forth between the breakout room. I haven't seen anybody go over there, so I've been coming back into the main session periodically.
All right. Any other questions?
Well, thanks, Sierra. This has been very informative. Great discussion of this topic.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye, everybody. Thanks a lot.
See you at the next
Bye.
time.
Okay, bye-bye.